All right, well, hello there, fifth graders. As we are moving on here in Chapter 1, we are now at the end of Chapter 1, so it's hard to believe that we're already kind of a couple weeks into the school year and moving right along, and so here we go. But we are continuing with what we kind of have been talking about in Chapter 1, and our first part of Lesson 1.7 is going to tell you to round the number to the place of the underlined digit. Round the number to the place of the underlined digit. So I have this number here, and as we've talked about previously, I would say this as 3 and 608 thousandths. So 3 and 608 thousandths. Now it's the 6 that's underlined. The 6 is in the tenths place, and so with the 6 in the tenths place, I'm now looking at the 0. And the 0 is going to tell me what to do. So we want to remember our rounding rules. If this number here, that's to the right or that comes after the place that we're rounding to, is 5 or higher, I want to round up. If this number is 4 or less, I'm going to round down. Now, rounding down does not mean that the number previously will change. If I round up, this number here will go up 1. If I round down, this number here will stay the same. And since this is a 0, I'm going to round down, which means everything before this 0 is going to stay the same. My 6 is going to stay a 6, and this is just going to end up as 3.6. And if I want to put the 2 zeros for those two numbers, I can, but that's not necessary. I can just leave that as 3 and 6/12. So I go to this next one, 47 and 218 thousandths. 47 and 218 thousandths. Well, it's the 7 that's underlined. So I actually need to look at the 2. The 2 is what is going to give me instructions. And remember the rule. 4 and less, I round down. 5 and higher, I round up. Okay? So we want to kind of think about that. Well, this number is 2, so it qualifies as 4 or less, which means I'm going to round down. But rounding down, remember, does not mean that this number becomes 1 less. It means that this number stays the same. So this is going to be 47. And if I want to put a 0.0, I can. If I just want to put that as 47, I can. But we want to remember that this 47 and 218 thousandths, if we're rounding to the ones place or the nearest whole number, it's either going to go down to 47 or up to 48, because 47 and 218 thousandths is bigger than 47, but it is less than 48. All right, moving right along. Round 8 and 765 thousandths to the nearest hundredth. Round 8 and 765 thousandths to the nearest hundredth. Well, the first thing I want to do is figure out what number is in the hundredths place. Well, this number right before the decimal is the ones place. This first place after the decimal is the tenths place, which means this 6 is what is in the hundredths place. If I'm going to round to that place where the 6 is, then I have to look at the 5, and the 5 is going to tell me what to do. So I go back to my rounding rule. 5 and higher, I round up. 4 and less, I round down. Well, this is a 5, so it qualifies as 5 or higher, which means I'm going to round up, which means this 6 is going to become a 7. Everything before this place is going to stay the same. So my 8 is going to stay an 8. My decimal stays in the same spot. My 7 is going to stay a 7. And since the 5 is telling me to round up, this 6 is also going to become a 7. And if I want to, I can put a 0 for the 5. Not necessary, though. I really don't want you to do that. I want you to be able to kind of see and minimize how many digits you have. But the correct answer is 8 and 77 hundredths. All right, next one, round 7 and 21 hundredths to the nearest whole number. Well, the key phrase here is nearest whole number. Now, I referenced the idea of the nearest whole number up when we did this one, with 47 and 218 thousandths. When we talk about rounding to the nearest whole number, that basically means we are rounding to the ones place. And the ones place, for nearest whole number, the ones place is this number right before the decimal, which in this case is a 7, because this is 7 and 21 hundredths. So since I'm rounding to the nearest whole number, which is the ones place where this 7 is, it's the 2 that is going to give me instructions on how to round it. And so once again, we think about our rounding rule. 5 and higher, I round up. Less than 5, I round down. Well, 2 definitely qualifies as being less than 5, so I'm going to round down. But let us remember, rounding down does not mean that I make the 7 a 6. Rounding down means that I keep the 7 a 7. Now, if I want to, I can add a decimal and a couple zeros. But like I said, that's not really necessary because everything after the place we round becomes a 0. But in that situation, you can do that. Or also, preferably, just 7 would be the answer. All right, you're going to have one section on your assignment that gives you a number, and it's going to have multiple place values that it wants you to round to. So here I have 6 and 704 thousandths. 6 and 704 thousandths. And first we're rounding to the nearest whole number. Well, as we just talked about, the whole number means we're rounding to the ones place. And in this situation, that's going to be the 6. So since I'm rounding to the ones place where the 6 is, it's the 7 that's going to give me instructions on what to do with the 6. Well, the 7 qualifies as 5 or higher, which means I'm going to round up, which means my 6 is going to become a 7. And if I want to, I can add decimal and zeros afterwards, but just 7 works just fine. Now to round that same number to the nearest tenth, when I'm looking at 6 and 704 thousandths, the number in the tenths place is the 7, right after the decimal. So since that's the number in the tenths place, it's the 0 that's giving me instructions on what to do with the 7. 5 and higher, I round up. 4 and less, I round down. Well, 0 definitely qualifies as 4 or less, which means I'm going to take the 7 and round down, which means remember that the 7 is actually going to stay a 7. So when I round it to the nearest tenth, my 6 stays the same, my decimal stays the same, and it's going to be 6.7. All right, the next one, 6 and 704 thousandths, rounding to the nearest hundredth. Same number, different place. So in the hundredths place, well, we have the tenths and then the hundredths, so it's the 0 in the hundredths place. Okay? Which means I'm looking at the 4. The 4 is telling me what to do. 4 and less, I'm going to round down. 5 and higher, I'm going to round up. Okay? Well, this 4 qualifies as 4 or less, which means I'm taking the 0 and rounding it down. Well, that just means that the 0 is going to stay a 0. So once again, my 6 is going to stay the same. My decimal is going to stay in the same spot. My 7 is going to stay a 7. And if I want to put that 0 in, I can. But remember our rules of decimals. That 0 doesn't make any difference. So if I want to put the 0 in, since we're keeping the 0 as 0, I can. But if I also just want to keep that as 6.7 or 6 and 7/10, I can do that too. All right? Either one of those answers would be acceptable there. All right, last part. Name the place value to which each number was rounded. Name the place value to which each number was rounded. So they're going to give you a number. In this case, our example is 27 and 518 thousandths. So once again, 27 and 518 thousandths being rounded to 30. So I see the change that took place here. I see that the first place where the numbers are different is actually the tens place, because here I have a 2 in the tens place. Here I have a 3 in the tens place. And so they're different. And sure enough, when I go and say, well, if I was rounding to the tens place with this 2, I would look at the 7. And the 7 would tell me to round up, because 5 and higher would round up, which means that my 2 would become a 3. Now I do need to put that 0 in the ones place because that comes before the decimal. You'll remember before, after the decimal, we talked about it not being important to have the decimal. Well, on this side of the decimal, before the decimal, it is very important because without the 0 here in place of the 7, we only have 3. And we actually need to have the answer 30. Now, you could leave it as 30, but if they were rounding it, okay, it could be, you could add those extra zeros. But the fact that we see that they rounded to the tens place, that the 7 told them to make the 2 a 3, when we name the place value, we can see very clearly that they rounded it to the tens place. All right, last one, 8 and 429 thousandths being rounded to 8.4 or 8 and 4/10. Well, the 8 is the same. The 4 in the tens place is the same. And then this is a 2. Well, it would make sense because we see here that here in the tens place, if I was looking at the tens place and I looked at the 2 would tell me to round down. Rounding down would mean that I would have to keep the 4 a 4, and then everything else would become a 0. And since it's after the decimal, I wouldn't need to put those zeros. I could just stop it at 8.4, which makes it very clear that from 8 and 429 thousandths to 8.4, we rounded it to the tenths place. All right, 5th grade, this brings us to the end of Chapter 1. No new videos for the next couple of days until after the test, and we get started on Chapter 2. All right, talk to you later, 5th graders. Bye.